Okay, so we are lucky to have Katie with us this week. I'm sure she gets a lot more seminar invitations than she can accept. And so yeah, I think we're very fortunate to have her. She is a plant ecologist whose work spans a tremendous breadth. She's worked at the population, at the community, at the ecosystem level. Her work spans from applied work like urban forestry and restoration all the way to coexistence, patterns of species diversity. We'll see in her talk tomorrow. She grew up in Colorado. She'll actually tell us a little bit about that today. She got her bachelor's degree from Williams in 1994, did her PhD with Deborah Goldberg at the University of Michigan, finished that in 1999, then went back to Colorado, CU Boulder for a postdoc. She's held faculty positions at UC Irvine, UC Berkeley, and CU Boulder, where she's been since 2014. She's highly decorated. She's a distinguished professor at CU Boulder. She's a fellow of the Ecological Society of America, of AAAS. She is the director of the Niwot Ridge LTER site. She has published over 150 papers that have been cited about 22,000 times. She's been on the ISI Web of Science highly cited list. And in 2018, she was the winner of ESA's Mercer Award, which is the highest, the most prestigious award that ESA gives. I've had the privilege of working with Katie on a grant, a USDA grant, for the past 4 years. And you know, I knew all these kinds of things about her, but hadn't worked directly with her until we started cooking up this proposal with not a whole lot of lead time before there was deadline. And we had a meeting with some other people. We handed Katie this list of all sorts of interesting, but totally disorganized and unconnected ideas. And about a week later, she sent us back a complete draft of a proposal that was totally coherent and compelling, and it got funded. So she's a pro. I think that's all I've got. Welcome me in welcoming Katie.
Thank you. Thanks everyone, and I've enjoyed my day. Thank you for having me, and I just it's super fun to talk with you all. It's also really fun to be able to talk about a couple different types of things that are really, I'm really keenly interested in, and where my passions lie. And today I'm going to talk about work kind of at the intersection of something that is kind of new and developing for me. And it's about a system that I know nothing about. And, it's kind of like one of those privileges about being in academics and being able to just jump into something that you think is just kind of interesting and you want to learn something more about it. So today I'm going to talk about the intersection between research, community outreach and service, and teaching, and how all those things are really synergistic, or should be synergistic, and how some of those things have played out for me. So I grew up in Evergreen, Colorado, which is in this kind of ponderosa pine forest, and I feel privileged to be able to, take my academic route and I actually be able to come back and actually live back in the place I grew up. But I just wanted to start here about just some of my lived experiences and how those kind of form where I find inspiration in my research. So, I spent lots of time exploring these systems, really being kind of just really interested in the natural history around, just outside my my back door. And also what was really formative when I was growing up is my dad was a geologist, and so he would take me out in the field with him, and who knows what he was doing. I still don't know anything about geology, but just that idea about how a scientist lives, right? And how, you can go places and you're just finding stuff, trying to figure questions out, really struck me at a young age. So I was kind of fortunate to have that influence. I've carried that influence through, in terms of how I started thinking about, what I wanted my research career to be and what my inspiration was, how I would focus. And I always would think about that the best place to try to kind of really touch people and really kind of communicate was outside, right? In the places that I found were really inspiring to me. And so working in the field, taking people out in the field, taking students out in the field, and trying to really share that same sort of inspiration. That has changed a little bit over time, and I want to focus on some of those changes today. The first thing is I had, I guess, the privilege of raising some kids, and I have a son and a daughter, and it struck me, and I think probably a lot of you can relate, that they really show you that you learn and you get inspired maybe a little bit differently than other people. And that some things that are easy for you might not be easy for everyone else, right? And so those pathways of discovery and inspiration are different for different people, kind of thinking about that diversity of thought and how you get, how you go back finding stuff that really keenly passionate about. In my case in particular, my daughter has some learning disabilities that really showcase how some things that are easy for some people are just really not easy for others. Secondly, there's two things that I'll go into more detail. First of all, I moved back to Colorado, and outside, in my kind of new house, in my new neighborhood, in this kind of abandoned field, I stumbled upon this really old tree, and I'll tell you more about that pretty soon. And also a new colleague in my department, Lisa Corwin, who actually is in ecology department, but doesn't specialize on ecological research per se, but how people learn and really so how that educational part of research and science writ large happens. And so that connection, and that's what I want to focus on today. Before I do that, though, kind of talk to you a little bit about kind of where I came from and where I kind of get inspired about doing what I want to do. I'd like to just stop and just have everyone just think about this question, because I think sometimes we do all these kind of everyday things and not stop and say, where do you find your inspiration about what you do, right? What you do in your career, in your research. And also, how does this inspiration translate, right, into desire to discover, improve the world, engage with your local community? I think everyone can have kind of these pictures and these kind of scenarios about what drives you to get up, right? What drives you to work? What drives you to ask the research questions that you get to ask, right? And how you want to connect with this kind of larger world that we live in. Okay. So, kind of a range of thoughts probably. When I think about this and when I kind of talk to people about this, a lot of times things range from just this inspiration in these wild places, right? These places that have the strong natural beauty, pristine, and also inspiration based on working with people, right? To have solve problems, kind of like have that community good. So here's my story of this old tree. So this is outside kind of my backyard. And I stumbled on it. Actually, I didn't stumble on it. My kids stumbled on it, and they brought back this huge pail of these green apples. So this is an apple tree. And I thought I knew Colorado because I grew up there. I felt like that was kind of my home base. And I had never realized about these trees. And so at first I thought, this must be a really, really special tree. And the apples were quite plentiful, and then they took me to this tree, and it was this old fort that said "keep out," and it had this special journal, and it was all hollowed out. It was clear that people, tons of people, loved this old tree. And so I thought, well, maybe I should try to, figure out what is this tree story, and this tree must be pretty unique, pretty special. And so kind of followed it over a year or two, and I started asking some questions just about, does anyone know about this tree, about apples in Colorado in general? And it turns out, I kept asking questions, and it turns out that these trees weren't that, this tree isn't that special around Boulder, that there's all these trees. They're all about a century, a little over a century old. And they kind of cover, kind of dot, and they're kind of remnants of this kind of past history of the community. And the more and more I asked questions, and I heard more and more stories, it was fascinating about where you could find these trees. So some of these trees you could find in the middle of nowhere, in the forest, in the mountainside, in the Flatirons, probably brought there by miners who had cabins, and they would plant 1 or 2 trees next to these cabins for apples. Really for hard cider, but for apples. Also, almost every agricultural rancher moving in would plant several trees in the front of their homesteads. So lots of trees there too. And also throughout the region, there are old orchards that were planted. We mostly have destroyed those orchards, turning them over to residential communities. And so they dot people's backyards, just the lucky ones that were able to survive the development. And then lastly, just to note, these are mostly kind of the remnants of this last century and a half that we see in Colorado and elsewhere in the United States. But we also know that there is this history of orchards being planted even before that by Native Americans for fruit bearing too, mostly from the South through the Spanish influence. And just to say, and I think I probably am talking to some people that really know a lot about this, but there's a lot of this. This is not just in Colorado. This is all over, and it's really quite special in the American West because these fruit trees are in places that are arid, that you're not used to finding trees that actually produce food. And in Utah, you have a lot too. Capitol Reef has a really historic orchard. And also there's a lot of history that a couple people in your faculty actually have really researched about old orchards that Native Americans have planted in the Four Corners areas. So the history of these trees really dot a lot of this region. Okay, but back to Colorado and kind of finding that this is actually probably a pretty big, a big pattern, and really interesting about all these stories that all these old trees could tell. So it turns out that they're looking at historical records, that there was a survey done kind of in the 20s, showed about 400 varieties of apple trees that were planted in Colorado. And so these aren't just the 12, maybe the 3 types of apples that you could get in the supermarket, right? So the apple diversity is immense. And so if you think about these records, most of these types of cultivars you would never find in a supermarket. You probably have never tasted. And these are really small crab apple, really tart, really large dessert apples, different colors, different flavors, some with red flesh, some that smell like tropical bananas. I mean, it's all over the place, this type of diversity that we once had in apples. A quick kind of survey found that many of these varieties are still here. They're still heirlooms that you could get at if you went to the right gardening store, but that about 25% of those 400 varieties are what we consider endangered. So we only have 1 or 2 records of them, and then 47% of those 400 we have no record of. We don't know if they're still there, if they're in someone's yard or not. So then I want to kind of turn the table a little bit, and this is kind of a little bit about my interactions trying to figure this question out, but then also talking to my colleagues about kind of discovery and, where do you go from here? What do you think? It's been just really interested in these old trees, but then also interested in this kind of process about discovery. How do you start figuring out kind of a system? And so if you think about being a student, whether you teach students, whether you are a student, whether you're both a student and you teach students, think about how do we inspire people to be interested in maybe the same things we are, or inspire people to kind of really pursue their passions. How do we do this? And how do we do this in ecology? And I would argue that this part of the Apple Tree Project has really made me reconsider how exactly we should do that, and what discovery is, and what research is, and why anyone would really get interested in science. So there's a couple ways that you could say, well, this is how we introduce people to research. So and it's largely on this kind of this gradient, right? Traditional labs where you show up for an afternoon, you have something that you follow, and you get this result, right? So that's most of Gen Bio, for instance, right? And you're learning about the photosynthesis mechanisms. And so you do this in order to collect this data. And if you do it right, you get the right result. And then maybe if you get more interested in research, you have the possibility to get involved with independent research. You get bold enough to knock on a professor's door, ask them, can I work with you, right? Can I work with you? I'd like to learn how to do stuff. And I'm sure that almost everyone here has been that bold person sometime and have gotten that chance to do independent research. Well, so there's some trade-offs here. There's a lot of more cost in terms of time and also in terms of just money, but being able to give as many people as maybe wants it this kind of independent research experience. To reach a lot of students, though, what we first do is give them a lot of labs, right? To get people to go through to learn at least some research. But then you'd argue that the student experience is much greater, right? If everyone had that kind of one-on-one opportunity to do their own independent work. So one thing that is kind of meets in the middle, and something that I think is really could have revolutionized how we really think about science and think about discovery and research, is what's called course-based undergraduate research. And we abbreviate this as CURES. And so this is something that is still a course. So it's done at scale, usually not full, 60, 100, 500 people, but in terms of a lab, that size course. But it is research in that it's not cookbook, that it's actually authentic research with a real question that no one knows, right? No one knows. So you're not leading students through something that is not true discovery. And there's been work about kind of these elements of a cure. And, it has to do with, learning scientific practices, authentic research, relevant to something, usually from published research products, collaboration with your peers, and iteration. And it turns out that doing this type of middle ground reaches a lot of students, but also gives people this view into inquiry, right, into that thrill of discovery, and into the idea about, oh, I could see myself as a scientist, right? I could really imagine the kind of this joy of being a researcher. There's been a ton of, well, it's actually kind of new, but there has been a lot of more recent stuff about really showing the efficacy of this kind of product, about really broadening the range of students that might actually consider themselves as a scientist. I was pretty lucky to have a father that was a scientist, and I could see how science was done and how that career was done. But most people aren't lucky like that. And so giving a first science experience in a big lecture hall might not be the way to win people over. Also thinking about ownership and how you view yourself as a scientist turns out to be much more effective in these cure courses. Then also thinking about kind of guiding, but not knowing the outcome as being a really critical part of research, and that even failures are a really good thing to kind of expose people to. And then also thinking about science identity and belonging, and how thinking about as a scientist going through true authentic experiences is being really important. So kind of started thinking about this intersection of kind of working on this just being really interested in these trees myself, and kind of starting to try to map these, trying to figure these out. And this is a discovery that I was doing, and I am not a tree person, right? I studied grasslands, diversity, right? So this is all kind of a new thing. And then how this intersects with student experiences. And so thinking about how maybe this is a good platform to think about cures, right? And think about how they might operate. And then also thinking about a cure, not just with authentic research experience, but adding to it a component of scientific civic engagement. So something about local relevance and importance to the community. So heck, if we publish something in the peer-reviewed literature, but actually thinking about being a scientist as a motivation for doing community good, doing social good, and how that is an important motivation factor for a lot of people in science. And so I want to build on that just a little bit in terms of why that might be really important if we think about who should be a scientist and how we should broaden that footprint. And so people have heard about civic engagement. I think that's pretty a common term. And so thinking about coining this kind of different way of thinking about it is thinking about whether you can really reach a much broader group of people and really get at that motivation and that inspiration by thinking about scientific civic engagement. And so thinking about using your science skills to connect with and improve community, right? Maybe your local community, and how that might relate to discovery and research. And so why would this be important? Well, there's been a lot of educational research suggesting that this might be something that we're overlooking. So this is a paper that found that first generation students experienced greater science interests when science was perceived as fulfilling a pro-social community purpose. And just think about that. Doesn't that make sense? that a lot of people want to be interested in science, but also want to do well for the greater good, right? And why can't those two things intersect? I think they intersect a lot with a lot of us. Research done on underrepresented minorities found that this idea about being able to link their STEM field to their personal and cultural values was key to having them feel like they could have an identity as a scientist. Okay, so how those things kind of link, and that they're not isolated, and just doing science in this kind of this unconnected kind of isolated arena only appeals to some people. Probably only appeals to people that have family members that are scientists already, right? And so, but I'm joking about that, but that you can actually feel like there's a greater world, right? And that you can achieve all these values based on this. And then lastly, I think we've all heard multiple calls for the idea about community aligned science. Science is really important to kind of starting to improve this wavering trust in science, right? And actually like interacting and more seeing how science can benefit everyone in society. So here is the team, and I'm going to talk about kind of our efforts, kind of merging these two things. And I just want to point them out because this is definitely a team effort, and several things I'm talking about would not be possible without all the team members. We have people here that have expertise in citizen science. We have people here, expertise in educational research, people here, expertise in history, in genetics, in urban ecology, and led by Lisa Corwin and I. And here is our basic kind of premise, our hypothesis, that if you expose students to research in a socially and locally important system, for instance, these old apple trees, that kind of research experience can increase research self-efficacy, as well as the sense of belonging to that place where they are. And this in turn would lead to greater science identity, as well as scientific civic engagement. And this would increase persistence in STEM. So broadening the group of people that might want to pursue a scientific career. Okay, so I showed you this diagram before about these cures and these kind of components about why it seems like a cure format actually works to reach a lot of students. And I want to just add a couple things about thinking about a scientifically civic engaged research experience. So one that is interdisciplinary, right? That is tackling societal problems, but kind of without boundaries. Secondly, with local relevance, right? So you're doing something and you're interacting with people one-on-one that really care about your research. And lastly, community collaboration, that it's not just the scientists going in and knowing all the answers, but actually learning from the community too, right? And so it's a two-way street there in terms of that the community values your expertise, but you also value theirs. So teaching those types of things in a research process. And so we've done this. This is, we actually are just completing our 4th year of doing this at CU. And it is a course for first-year students and transfer students. And I don't know why CU allowed us to do this, but it substitutes. People can take this course on apple trees instead of taking Gen Bio. There's also community college modules and bridge programs. We're really focusing on that first-year experience, because sitting in all these lecture halls for Gen Bio and then other courses, and then only taking a research course when you're your 4th year, you lose so many people, right? So that first experience, we've really been arguing, that should be the research experience. That should be where people feel that thrill of discovery, inquiry, And then they can go learn about the Krebs cycle and memorize this and that afterwards, right? But let's get the thrill first, right? And get that kind of real interest about this might be the right place for me. And then we center it around the Apple Tree Project, but we have partners across the nation that are centering around other kind of locally relevant issues too. I don't think apples in particular are any better than many other things. Okay, so what does this look like? First of all, it is totally authentic research and discovery. We have no idea what we're finding, right? We are looking for trees. We're trying to preserve these trees, who they are, their stories, their history. And so we have students out there working with the community, tagging, mapping, sampling as part of this course. All in all, I started just, of course you have unique identifiers, right? So I started tagging trees, taking measurements, and it started just kind of growing. We have a protocol that anyone can download as an app, and all these trees in all these different settings with all these different types of fruit and different histories. It's been phenomenal. We found many heritage or heirloom cultivars and just the mapping around Boulder. Many of these are kind of have geographic roots. For instance, the Northwest greening is the tree that I told you about. That one's thought to have been brought by a coal miner. My town where I live is a coal mining town from Wisconsin. Right, so you can kind of put together these histories. Winter banana is a southern tree, so the kind of some people coming out from the south. All in all, we have almost 1,000 trees surveyed and marked, and 43 unique cultivars identified. Okay, so totally authentic research, or at least we are learning as we are doing for sure. Also locally relevant, and I have to say, I think that's a really huge thing for a lot of student experiences, right? This is places that people live, right? There's trees in people's backyards to sample and to figure out. We have, as a course of this, detected several local cultivars. So these are trees that are clearly propagated because they have genetic matches with other trees in the sampling, but they are not in the USDA reference database. So these are probably locally rare, right? So these are probably trees that are only in existence in these areas. So students find these. We can even name these, right? And we can try to connect them to some of the historically lost cultivars. All in all, we found 24 of these. And so these are utmost important to conserve. We also are focusing on ecosystem services of these orchards, kind of perennial agriculture in a very semi-arid landscape. I am sure you all can recognize the value in terms of pollinators, soil health, much broader goods, lower water inputs, lower chemical inputs. And along those lines, we are working, the city has donated land and everything, labor, to actually start a community learning orchard, where we're allowed to put an experimental design in this orchard. And so we are putting in the lost cultivars, propagating them by grafting, so have replicate kind of tree phenology, so different tree traits, as well as different understory traits aimed at different services like soil health, pollinator health, structural complexity for pest reduction. Interdisciplinary, we work with people in the history department. There has actually been a history cure run, trying to interview people, bring the history out. computer science people. We have cures there too, trying to develop kind of citizen science apps. Mostly, we work a lot with museums, and we've had exhibits at the CU Natural History Museum, as well as the Boulder Museum, as well as the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art. And we also are working on an installation right now with artists from Syracuse, putting in these trees along an agricultural gradient and actually grafting 40 different cultivars on one tree, right? And so having a tree that kind of represents all the agricultural history of a given area. We do a lot of community information gathering, so getting the information from the community back to us, because we don't know anything about these trees, right? So we need to do that, and also work a lot with the oral history heritage project with historical interviews. We also, there's a lot of collaborations, but one of the big ones and one of the very enthusiastic partners that we have is actually the Cider Makers. And because most of these trees weren't eating apple trees, right? Most of these trees were cider trees. And so the real idea about actually finding and actually having local, just like local food, right? Locally derived cider is a big deal. And actually, I shared a stage with local cider maker at Science Friday, trying to describe cider flavors from Ira Plato, and I did terrible, but luckily the other guy was there to be able to describe the different varieties. But it's amazing, though, those connections, and those connections really make a difference to the students, right? They really feel like they can make a big impact. So we've had 4 grafting workshops, and actually have distributed a lot of grafts also back to the community so that they can preserve their trees, or whatever tree is really special to them, as well as a way of that community involvement. And then lastly, just 2 components that are kind of a big feature of the class that we run. First is Apple Blitz, where in September, where is kind of the prime fruiting time for these trees. We run a Blitz where we pair students from the class, as well as alumni students, with community members, and we send them out to sample. And so the students are the expert. They know the protocol, they know how to measure these trees, and the community members are there with them, right, to learn and help and to collect this data. So it's kind of a merging of citizen science and really having the student feel like they are the researcher, right, and they are the ones knowing how to collect this data. We also, actually, this was last week for this year, run a symposium that we call the Boulder Apple Tree Symposium, where all the students present posters of the research that they did for that semester. And so we have the students present research to community. We usually get about 100 people there, as well as bring in outside people from different places across the United States. I'm not going to freak out. There, okay. Across the United States. So we have researchers from outside of CU, as well as the students sharing their work. Okay. Oh, and then also just to say, it's highly publicized. It's really easy for media to take these kind of events and really publicize them and get people interested in them. So a lot of local coverage. Okay. So we've tried to change it here, and I have to say that it's been really, really fulfilling. And we're finding out a lot about these apple trees along the way. But are we achieving our goals? Like, what are the student kind of discovery outcomes? And so, first of all, kind of what evidence about community members, right? Are they perceiving this kind of pro-social civic engagement purpose of this research? And I'm just going to give a couple quotes here, but it is amazing how it can really impact kind of the community about bringing research that is relevant for them, right? And listening to them, that's local, right? And so the engagement has been really, really important to a lot of people in the community. And so thinking about ways that the community can participate in a meaningful way. And then a second quote here, it's that it has a the idea about that it's really opens up the research to the community members too, right? That they can participate in research. And then what about student outcomes? And we focused more on this, so I'll spend a little bit more time on this. I'm going to give you just one example of some interview from a transfer student. So I think working on this project is beyond beneficial. It feels real, like the work I'm doing in the lab isn't just busy work that doesn't pertain to anything, but instead has purpose and meaning. I like that, and I think that it might be beneficial towards my future scientific communication because it's showing me how a future job might be. And then lastly, learning how to communicate with those outside my field results in greater understanding for me about how to teach others, right? So really that interchange is super, super important. And this comes up again and again. When we try to, of course, thinking about data, right? We collect a lot of data too. And we collect data, we find strong gains in kind of scientific skills of these people, right? Early on in their career, how to generate a research question, how to collect data, how to explain study results. But we realize that when we do this and we do this kind of typical assessment, that we're really not getting at the heart of what the purpose of this class and this kind of Boulder Apple Tree Project is. You know, it's really motivating was kind of that idea about scientific civic engagement, right? And how that might benefit people. And so what about that? And we realized when we started doing that there was no survey vehicle. There was no way of assessing that. People hadn't really done that before. So we went back and we actually had to generate an instrument to start thinking about this. And I think this is really important because I think it's something that just kind of demonstrates that we were kind of overlooking this important piece. And so this is work from a PhD student, Irfan Alam. Okay, and also I'm not going to go into a lot of this because this isn't really, I think, probably the fields of many people, but it takes a lot to generate a survey instrument that you can be confident in. And just, I want to just, but I do want to focus on a couple different dimensions about how we can think about scientific civic engagement in a quantitative way. So first of all, the idea about the value and importance of engaging with the community using science skills, okay? So for instance, some of the questions that we would ask is, I have a responsibility to help solve my community problems using, in this case, biology skills. Secondly, that you know how to do this, right? It's not just knowing how science works, right? It's knowing how to engage and help the community. So I know how to use my biology skills to help my community. Thirdly, feeling confident that you can positively impact your community, right? So that confidence is super important to decide that you really want to pursue this and be passionate about it, okay? So, so the idea about positive impacts. And lastly, feeling like you can take action, right? That you could do something and really make a difference, right? And so, for instance, I plan to help with a community event or organization using my biology skills. Like, isn't that amazing? Wouldn't that be great, right? So kind of getting that, that element involved. So did that. Okay, so I want to just talk to you about just a little bit of results about using those types of assessments. And so this is work where we did pre-survey and post-survey of a student population. And we're comparing people that went through the apple tree cure with people that took just a normal Gen Bio lab. Okay, and I want to point out that there is some differences in terms of the type of people that these surveys we surveyed based on who was taking the Gen Bio lab and who was taking the Apple Tree Cure. We emphasize in the Apple Tree Cure transfer students and students with kind of diverse backgrounds. And so that could also be reflected in some of the stuff I'm showing you. Okay, so first of all, we see a pattern of increased scientific identity, people taking the Apple Tree Cure. And how you read this is just the change in this this Likert scale. So that's how you when you take a survey and you go 1 to 6, is like how strongly you believe in a certain statement. Okay, so that's that. And it's the change between pre and post. So how much just one semester course might affect things. And the Gen Bio really, the students really did not change in terms of a question like, I feel like I belong in the field of science. Doesn't matter if you take Gen Bio or not, right, based on that. But doing something like this Apple Tree Cure, it did increase it. And then secondly, we do see also kind of a similar increase in scientific civic engagement, a little lower increase. And it's interesting that the actual Gen Bio actually turns negative a little bit. And so, but for an example question here, I'm confident that I can contribute improving life in my community using my biology skills. And so I'm not going to go a lot of detail about this, but we really feel like when we're gonna continue measuring or following up with these students as they go through the 4 years and see how this affects. But in general, that we see that the students do kind of start improving many dimensions of their scientific civic engagement with this, and that we are interested to see how that might translate into longer term persistence in STEM, but that idea about more time and more experiences, I think, is still an open question. And then importantly also that students in this kind of course really felt more like they were scientists, right? And that they had a stronger scientific identity, which I think is amazing as freshmen, right? As early students to be able to build that early. We're actually expanding this now and thinking about cure lets. And so instead of a whole semester cure, thinking about little cures that that people can put into a class that's pre-existing. So a day, a week, maybe 2 weeks. And we're working with community colleges around the state to kind of try to reach more people and reach more people with a lot of diverse backgrounds. And also a lot of community college students are really much strongly connected to their local community, right? They live there, right? They grew up there. And so thinking about how that might affect this efficacy. And so we have 7 partner schools in this region, and we have many other collaborators across this effort. We're hoping probably in the next couple months that we'll probably change the name from Boulder Apple Tree Project to Rocky Mountain because of this regional emphasis. And just lastly, so we're thinking about, where we're going and thinking about how these kind of these goals intersect really nicely. And I think that's just a thrill of being able to think about establishing orchards that can be both experimental, but also really valuable to the community, preserving these unique trees through both community and education, as well as research. And then also just reaching a lot of students, right? And having this be a really important kind of first experience and maybe affecting how many people decide to be a scientist. Okay, so there's a lot of acknowledgements, and I just have to say that the collaboration across community and academic partners is just key to all these things that I'm saying. And that's it. Thank you very much.